Curt Covington grew up in California, surrounded by almonds, grapes, and cotton. He's off the farm these days, and he's working for a firm that lends to farmers, but his concern is about the farm. Hi, and welcome to the American Farmland Owner Podcast. I'm Dave Price. Curt is just a few years away from having half a century in the financial side of farming. These days, he's a senior director of managed accounts at AgAmerica Lending. He's based in Lakeland, Florida. Now, he is not convinced that farmland can keep appreciating the way it has been with so many forces working against it, unless something changes. We're going to get to why he thinks that way in a few minutes, but first, where this farm boy learned finance. Hey, we always like to know a little bit about the guest before we start digging into things. So tell us how you got to where you are.
Good to see you again, Dave. So I started my career about a short 47 years ago. I think it's 47. It's around 1978, 1979. Started like every other ag banker in the farm credit system. Seems like we all get hatched kind of in the farm credit system. I was born and raised in a farm community and in farming outside of Fresno, California. So I'm kind of a Western ag guy. Our family grew. In those days, there weren't a lot of almonds, oddly enough. Now it's pretty much all almonds and pistachios, but we farmed grapes and walnuts and cotton and a few other crops. But I started my career in farm credit system, spent a good amount of time there, and then migrated over to Rabobank. I was like the third employee at Rabobank out in the Western U.S. So I was kind of there at the tip of the spear. That would have been in like 2002 or 2003, then migrated over as Chief Ag Risk Officer for Bank of the West, which was owned by the French, which is now owned by the Canadian French. It's called Bank of Montreal. Yeah, I can't seem to get away from the Dutch and the French. Anyway, and then was offered a position as Executive Vice President, Chief Credit Officer at Farmer Mac in Washington, D.C. Retired at the age of, 65. 6 days later, realized, it probably wasn't the smartest move in the world. I mean, it was kind of a requirement, but so I went back to work, started working with AgAmerica down here in Florida, doing institutional work, and have been here ever since, which is now coming up on close to 5 years or so. So if you do the math, I'm almost 70.
So you've seen a few things.
A few. Yeah. Some I'd prefer not to remember, but yeah.
But there's always the good and bad of it, right? But, as we get older, that kind of gives you the perspective on things. And I'm curious, before we start digging into this land survey, so what do you make about what you're seeing? We had a couple of years post-COVID when things were crazy, right? Government's throwing a bunch of money out there. For the most part, folks are doing pretty well. Now we're kind of coming back to earth in 23 and 24. What's your assessment of things?
There's a lot of similarities between today and what we saw in the 80s. Do I think we're going to have the same kinds of problem we saw in the 80s? I don't think so. There were some other dynamics taking place there. My assessment of where we are today starts with this. I work with a number of people and have worked with a number of people over the years. There's probably less than 5 to 10% of those that is still in the business that lived through the 80s. Unfortunately, I happen to be one of them. So I have a different perspective on how things can go bad like really quickly. And so I think part of my job is here. Sometimes people ask me questions. And so I look at it kind of as a mentorship. Like if you think it can't get any worse, or if you've got dirt, it's your collateral and you can't get hurt, I beg to differ with you. So I honestly think we're at a bit of a turning point here. Interest rates, as far as I'm concerned, probably can't come down fast enough.
Sure.
And it's not so much the business I'm in, which is, the real estate debt, but if you're having to borrow money on $4 corn and having to borrow money on $11 beans. It doesn't work at 8.5% interest rate. I don't care who you talk to. When, your interest rate triples over the last 2.5 years, it's taken away directly from the bottom line margin of that business. And you add to that these stubborn input costs that just don't seem to want to moderate. There are some, right? I mean, you've seen it. There are some, but labor's a nasty cost depending on where you're operating. But even seed, fertilizer, chemicals, they're still at levels, as far as I'm concerned, that aren't supported by $4 corn and $11 beans. So here's what's going to have to happen. These, and I'm sorry to just drag on here, but you can tell me to stop at any time. But farmers saw the good times. Interest rates were low a couple, 2.5 years ago. Land prices were, well, in many cases, still probably didn't support the crops that were being grown on that property. Even at $7 corn, probably didn't support it. But now we're in a situation where debt doesn't go away. Debt and living expenses are two things that are very difficult to ratchet back. And people say, well, how bad? Living expenses are all fixed costs. Debt is a fixed cost. It doesn't care if corn is at $4. It doesn't care if corn's at $24. It just doesn't care. And that has to be serviced. So as your margins come down, the cost of that debt becomes a much larger percentage of the take on your profitability. So we're starting to see some real issues in the marketplace, both on the operating side and on the term real estate debt payments.
Okay, let me ask you this. Now, you pointed out a lot of folks that are still doing it today weren't doing it in the 80s. But the one thing, and this is what I was pointing back to perspective, do you agree with this from what some others are saying too? One of the differences today versus the 80s is that folks are not, fortunately, leveraged the same way they were in the 80s. You agree with that?
I do, with the one exception, is that there's two components to being levered and over-levered. We continue, kind of the point of our conversation today, you continue to see land prices, in my mind, that still seem to be overvalued, given where some of these commodities are. That's number one. And so when we talk about they're not overly levered, when you look at the USDA numbers, those USDA numbers forget about the anecdotal evidence that they, their algorithms and all that stuff, but it's an actual debt to market value equity. It's not debt to book value equity. So as land prices continue to increase, it gives you a false sense. It kind of gives you a false sense of security that the leverage position of these farmers is better than what it was in the 80s. And my response to that is, I absolutely believe that it's kind of a false indicator because at some point these land prices cannot continue to increase. And when that happens, you'll see an immediate drop in the quality of that asset, meaning the debt to asset ratio is going to continue to rise. And there's just honestly not much you can do about it, right? And that's why it's so important. And we always talk about this, old people always talk about this in the business, right?
Experienced people, right?
Oh, yeah. Old people like me, I guess, right? Here's kind of the situation. I always talk about this. Liquidity or working capital is always your first defense against price volatility. So if corn goes from $8 to $7 to $6 to $5, having liquidity in your balance sheet, meaning working capital, true, legitimate working capital. And if you can have that in the form of cash, is crucial because you can live through those cycles of working capital. Leverage, on the other hand, just plain debt in general, it kills the business. Liquidity is the first indicator that you're going to have solvency problems. It's the first indicator that you're going to have problems paying your debts. It's the very first indicator. So when we talk to farmers, We don't talk about debt to asset ratio, honestly. The first thing I talk to them about is maintaining your liquidity position so you can keep your vendors current, you can keep your operating lender current, you can keep your term debt lender current, even in times like this where corn is probably not going to head back up to $5 or $6, right? It's going to stay where it is today. So ultimately, your question being, the debt to asset ratio is still in good shape. I just tend to think that, that's, for me, it's kind of a false indicator.
So then, to kind of put a finer point on this, so with let's talk generically here. So with the government side of this, all this kind of post-COVID aid, with that backing off in 23, 24, this liquidity you talk about, that's what's getting squeezed with
Yep.
all that additional coming in?
Yes. And so part and parcel to this problem is there are a number of I have to be careful how I say this, but the government plays a huge role in the success of farmers. In fact, in my opinion, probably too much of a role. The market itself indicates to us that land prices should be declining. It also tells us that the liquidity position of these farmers is sometimes bolstered by government programs. And my personal opinion is I think the crop insurance program could certainly be enhanced to offset that. But for me, if you wanted agriculture to be right-sized and you want it to operate in an efficient model, you can't have a whole lot of government involvement supporting cash prices and supporting these farmers through some of these tough times. You're going to have the natural falling off the cliff.
So for the members of Congress who have not been willing to work together last year, this year to get some kind of farm bill agreement, maybe they do in the lame duck session of Congress after the election here in maybe mid to late November, December. What's your advice? So you've got a chunk of folks in there, perhaps it's a small chunk, but who actually care about the debt of this country and its financial future. And then, as we know, the Farm Bill is so much more than just agriculture. So when you're talking about looking at what these government programs should be, what's your advice to these members of Congress if they want to, what do you do if you care about government spending, but you also care about payments and support for farmers and producers? I mean,
That's a tough question. So yeah, part of the tough question is you and I both know over 75% of every dollar inside that goes to the SNAP program, right?
Right.
And until you extract the SNAP program from the Farm Bill, there is no negotiation around this. Effectively, what happens is those that want to support agriculture will support growth in the Farm Bill. Those that support the SNAP programs are going to want to see increases to the cost, and think about the cost of food and inflation, right? They're going to want to see some significant increases to the SNAP program. My issue with that is it's a long-term thing. Do I think the SNAP program should be inside the Farm Bill? No, it needs to be in finance. It needs to be health and welfare. It needs to be someplace other than agriculture. That being said, honestly, I just don't, there's the farm programs as we know it have been somewhat gutted over the years, right? They've been somewhat gutted over the years, and it represents such a small portion of the overall size of the Farm Bill. I would simply say that all they're going to be able to do now is work together to get a solution, and this Farm Bill is going to be the most expensive one we've ever seen if it gets done.
Iowa has a longtime Senator Chuck Grassley, a Republican who is a farmer, and I've talked to him over the years about the impracticality of linking these two things together. And he's mentioned, look, at the end of the day, you've got very few members of Congress who have any natural connection to agriculture. And this is kind of how it gets done. And it's almost the only way to try to get it through. Although you could argue it's not a functioning way to get through if you can't come to an agreement. So why not just strip the two things separately and try a different approach?
Yeah, and I think that's my personal opinion, and I think there's another component to this that I think is, you brought it up. We have so many members of Congress that have no idea what the Farm Bill is even about. They don't come from a farm background. The greatest number of, young Congress persons today that have to be educated on what the Farm Bill is. And here we come up to November, and there's going to be probably some turnover inside Congress and inside Senate, and the Farm Bill is going to come up, right to your point, probably sometime after the election. The first 6 weeks of that are going to be teaching the young congressman exactly what is this bill. I don't understand. How does the Farm Bill have anything to do with the SNAP program? I mean, that's the basics of this is, and I suspect, and I've known some young congressmen that come in, you talk to them, they say, yeah, it just doesn't make sense. I get it 50, 60 years ago that probably made some sense. Today, it just simply doesn't make sense. It needs to be its own title. And again, whether that's, in finance or health and human service, I just don't know, but it doesn't belong in the Farm Bill.
Okay, you talked about land values earlier. So AgAmerica does this national land survey. And now you're talking about, hey, maybe land values are overinflated here. They're still cranking at about 5% nationally. Why is that?
There's still, and we talked about this, there's still a lot of farmers that still have a lot of cash in their pockets. They've done well. They've managed their balance sheet. They probably have low leverage. And they look at this and say, okay, if I pay $15,000 an acre, or $20,000 an acre for this property, and I dollar cost average that across all of my debt, it's kind of a cheap purchase, right? And I think that's one side of it. The other side of it is as well, there's fewer and fewer high quality pieces of land across the United States that are available. And when they do show up, it becomes a bit of a bidding war. And I don't care whether that's California, where you find a piece of property that's not only got good soil types, but good water. The price continues to be a bidding war. I don't care whether that's right in Iowa, where the corn suitability rating is in the northwest corner of the state. It just tends to bid up those prices. But I think generally speaking, when you look at lower valued properties that don't have the characteristics to produce the highest crops or maybe have the best access to water, I think we're starting to see some of those land prices starting to migrate down. And we've seen it both in the Midwest and we've seen it out west as well.
And what about factors? So you're in Florida as we talk here. You look at the Tampa area, the Orlando area, the area in between there. For these areas that are blowing up residentially and they keep eating into the available farmland, what kind of pressure is that putting, and how much do you think that is also, you talked about this lack of high quality land that's up for sale. I mean, if we're going to keep eating away at our farmland, isn't that going to keep pushing the pressure up?
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of urban encroachment, particularly down here in Florida for a number of reasons. Don't need to get into the politics of it, but I live in Lakeland. I'm halfway between Orlando and Tampa. Love Tampa. Not a big fan of Orlando. But ultimately, housing in Orlando and in Tampa both are unaffordable for the average middle class family. You can still come to areas like Lakeland, Florida, buy a home, get a starter home, maybe it's your second home, and you commute into Tampa. So, they always talk about this, right? And hopefully this isn't an inappropriate thing to say. You're either going to pay with your rear end or you're going to pay with your pocketbook.
Right.
I mean, I could.
You gave us the
PG version of that. I
yeah.
gave you the politically correct version of that. You're either going to drive for an hour and a half or an hour. And if you're going to Orlando, it's going to be a 2-hour drive in the morning. But you have reasonable cost of living in Lakeland, Florida. That being said, you're seeing Tampa and Orlando pushing on the central part of Florida because they have ways of just taking basic swamp ground or good farm ground, depending on it. And these developers are willing to pay that price because they see they can build a 700 unit residential development and get it sold literally once it's developed, have it sold off in 18 months, fully occupied. And quite frankly, it's not just residential, but we see a lot of commercial development here. I've never seen more self-storage facilities go up in any part of the world than in Florida. Yeah. And people are moving down here. They got no place to put it. Yeah. So these storage facilities is just jam-packed with people that are wanting to live here, but it's eating away at those land, that good available farm ground, but it's driving these prices up to the point where it's almost uneconomical to farm.
Okay, one of the things you do in this land survey is you do see the differences geographically. So I'm standing in Iowa, Nebraska is still going 5-6% depending on which state here. Some other areas of the country, going, some other ones slowing down a little. Are you seeing, is it individualized by state where you're seeing trends? Are you seeing more kind of pockets geographically? What are you seeing?
You kind of see pockets driven by what commodities are predominantly being grown there. And so obviously you go to the I states and good farm ground for good corn ground is still commanding a premium over the average price in the market. I could have told you a year ago that land prices out in California were climbing at 6 to 7 to 8 to 13%, depending on where it was and what commodity could be grown. I can almost promise you next year when this land survey comes out, because it's kind of a year behind, that you're going to see a decline in land values in California because there isn't really one single commodity out there that's knocking the cover off the ball. So it is very much commodity driven.
And that, speaking specifically about California, man, when you're talking about as a kid, almonds, right?
Yep.
You guys had almonds? That obviously that blew up and it expanded and that became kind of one of the top producers in that region. But then we've had a host of problems, some caused by water availability, some with the tariff war, all this kind of stuff. I mean, do you see this kind of a statewide decline for them, just kind of in the nut industry overall?
Not only the nut industry, but also in other industries. Look, I'll give you two poster childs of two specific industries that are only in California. One is obviously the nut business, and I don't care whether you're talking almonds or pistachios, doesn't make any difference. Both of them are seeing incredible pressures on margins. I know very few almond growers out in California that are actually making it work today. Yeah. It's at any price under $2 a pound for almonds at the grower level at the farm gate is a loser. You're losing money. We're seeing bankruptcies left and right in the almond space. Not just small acreages, thousands of acres. And it's usually the large operators. We saw the large operators grow. They had the capacity, they had the capital financing, they had the water, they had everything. Now they got nothing. We're seeing a couple of these large growers that are unfortunately being sued and or are going through bankruptcy. And it's public knowledge. The other one that is, probably the real poster child of this is the wine grape industry. I mean, I can tell you today, there is pretty much the lowest demand for wine that I have seen in the U.S. markets because the generation behind both of us, somewhere back, they're just not drinking wine. They've chosen other favorites, right? Yep. And the vats are full. Wineries aren't purchasing wine grapes. There's not sufficient storage capacity. And so what you're seeing is a bloodbath in the wine grape industry. I think you're going to see, so for example, the highest valued properties, say in Napa Valley, $250,000 an acre. those will probably stick around, right? I mean, just because it's in a region where there's only a small amount of acreage and you want it, you pay for it. It's everywhere else across that state is going to see some significant issues. So those are just examples inside California, but you can have similar examples, in other parts of the country.
So what are you thinking as you look ahead to 25? Optimistic, pessimistic? I mean, are you thinking, you've already said you think this may finally be the time where land prices start moving back down. You've already highlighted some of the troubled industries. One of the things that really stands out to me, we've been doing this podcast for about a year and I didn't come from an ag background. We are, as a country, unbelievably good at growing stuff. Unbelievably good. Our technology keeps getting better. We keep losing farmland every year, right? Like we don't expand, we just keep losing it to other stuff. But yet we keep making more and more and more and more. And where we struggle is that we can't increase the demand for this stuff enough. And so we have a lot of these producers who are amazing at growing, but they're not getting what they need to make a living out of it. And as you've pointed out, the liquidity is going the wrong way.
Yeah.
So are we going to see, is this going to be a painful couple of years ahead where we're going to lose producers because
No
that's
question.
what the market is? I mean, what do you think?
No question. Anecdotally, the best example of what you just gave was the dairy industry. The dairy industry across the United States. There's an old kind of metric. Once you reached over 9.3 million cows that were producing milk, you could surely count on the fact that there would be a crash of milk prices. It's no longer 9.3 million cows. It's something significantly less than that. And again, data around this is still lagging, coming in. But let's say that that's now, instead of 9.3 million cows, it's 9 million cows. And why is that? It's because when I started in banking back in the late 70s and early 80s, if a cow produced 65 pounds of milk, she was like on the front of DHIA's, annual, I mean, these guys were like, it's like you were at a rock concert, right? They're the best. If you're getting 65 pounds today, you're like, it's time to check out, right? Hang up the boots and call it a day. And the problem with it is it just isn't going from 85 pounds to next year 87 pounds to next year 88 pounds or 80. It's growing geometrically. It's almost as I have clients in parts of the US that produce milk, and I go, there's no way you're producing 92 pounds there. Oh yeah? Let me show you. 2 years ago, I was producing 84. Now I'm producing 92, and I produce it consistently. The challenge with that is what you end up with is the exact problem that you're stating, which is we have fewer producers, but more milk on the marketplace. And whether it's cheese, milk, yogurt, ice cream, whey byproducts, whatever it might be. The challenge with all this is consumption grows at the rate of the birth rate. And in the United States, it's less than 2%. And so if you're growing at a rate of 2% and milk production is growing at a pace of 3 or 4%, that can be enough to literally collapse the market like it did in 2009.
So are exports our solution here?
Yeah, unfortunately, exports aren't as robust as we'd like. So do we need to do trade policy? Does agriculture need some support in terms of trade policy? The question is yes. There are others that would say, well, we really just need to focus on corn and beans and other commodities as being a national security issue. We need to take care of, our own needs here first. That's great, but we have grown production in almost every sector of agriculture, almost every sector, meaningful sector of ag, beyond what we can consume, literally beyond what we can consume. The other piece of this is there are other countries that are catching up to us very quickly in our commodities. And so now we're not, one of the things they always said was, the thing about US agricultural policy was our goal was to produce the the highest quality product at the lowest possible price for the American consumer. That's certainly still the focus of our ag policy. The problem with it is there are other countries that can produce some of these commodities just as well as we can. And those commodities are subsidized. And if you're going to be competing with other countries that subsidize their growers in the export market, then unfortunately we have to make a decision whether we're willing to subsidize growers into the export markets, which then goes back to the Farm Bill. Yeah. And so trade policy to me is going to be the biggest dynamic in terms of the success of agriculture over the next 5 years.
So we don't want to get too hard into politics here, but yeah. one of the presidential candidates here, Donald Trump's talking about expanding tariffs. He has talked within the last week, he talked about limiting some of our agricultural imports as the way to try to help our producers. What does that do to the marketplace? Both things.
To me, it's very, look, yeah, again, I don't want to get in politics. I tend to be on his side on a lot of things, but when it comes to things such as this, particularly, look, agricultural commodities, there's this somehow misunderstanding that commodity prices aren't necessarily impacted by household income. So very inelastic, right? You know, if you don't have much money, you're still going to spend the same amount of money on beef and cheese and chicken. And the challenge with that model is if you have a robust and you're trying to grow an export business and you try to limit the amount of product coming into this country for families that want cheap, you know, food cost at the household level, I think it's going to create some problems. But, you know, I give you this as kind of an anecdotal story, right? There was a study done, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years ago, and they said, what do you think the most inelastic agricultural products are? And then there was a list of 20 different things: beef, chicken, cheese, you know, milk. I mean, went all the way down into vegetables. And there was two interesting ones on there: coffee and water. Those two were consistently viewed as the most inelastic, meaning you would sell your children for bottled water and you would sell your children's children for a cup of Starbucks. Everything else, right? Everything else is expendable, or you trade down. So to answer your question more directly, I don't think it's helpful we start having trade wars around food. I just don't think it's helpful.
All right, we'll leave it at that.
Yeah,
we appreciate it. Thank you much.
You're welcome.
He is Curt Covington, Senior Director of Managed Accounts at AgAmerica Lending. For more on Curt's background and what AgAmerica expects in 2025, head to our website, AmericanFarmlandOwner.com, and check out our weekly newsletter. Just go in there, enter your email address, and get that newsletter sent right to you for free. It's the latest conversations, issues, challenges, and opportunities for farmland owners, operators, and investors. It's AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for checking that out. Thanks for listening to the American Farmland Owner podcast. And thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.